The thing that hurts a narcissistic person most is not your anger. It is the moment they realize they no longer control your emotional state. You can scream at them, argue with them, expose them, beg them, or spend hours trying to make them understand what they did, and they may still feel powerful. But when you become calm, clear, and emotionally unavailable to the game, something changes. Because today I want to show you 4 things that can feel like psychological torture to someone who depends on controlling your attention, but they are actually acts of self-liberation. And the 4th one is the hardest because it requires you to stop waiting for them to become the person you needed them to be. Think about this for a moment. Why does someone else's behavior have the power to determine whether you have a peaceful day? Why does their silence make you anxious? Why does their criticism make you question yourself? Why does their sudden affection make you forget the pain they caused? There is something deeper happening here. When we become caught in a relationship organized around manipulation, we can gradually lose contact with our own inner signals. We begin monitoring the other person's moods instead of listening to our own needs. And that's where the real work begins. Not with punishing them, with returning to yourself. One of the most powerful things you can do when dealing with narcissistic behavior is to stop giving the emotional reaction that keeps the cycle alive. This does not mean becoming cold, cruel, or pretending you have no feelings. It means learning to recognize that your reaction is yours to choose. When someone knows exactly which words will make you angry, jealous, defensive, or desperate to explain yourself, they may repeatedly push those buttons because they have learned that your emotional response gives them influence. The moment you begin pausing, instead of reacting automatically, that influence starts to weaken. Imagine receiving a message designed to provoke you. Your first instinct may be to respond immediately, defend yourself, and correct every accusation. But instead, you take a breath. You notice the tension in your body. You allow the anger to exist without immediately turning it into action. You tell yourself, I don't have to solve this right now. That small pause creates psychological space between what happened and what you choose to do next. This is important because emotionally charged interactions can pull you into a familiar role. You become the person who explains, proves, argues, reassures, or begs to be understood. The other person becomes the one who decides when the conversation begins, how intense it becomes, and when it ends. Breaking that pattern means refusing to participate in every emotional invitation. You might respond with a simple statement such as, I'm not discussing this while we're speaking disrespectfully. Or you may decide that no response is necessary at all. The goal isn't to punish them with silence. The goal is to stop abandoning yourself in an attempt to manage someone else's emotions. And something changes when you repeatedly practice this. You begin discovering that uncomfortable feelings can rise without controlling you. Anger can exist without becoming an argument. Anxiety can exist without becoming a desperate message. Hurt can exist without becoming a plea for validation. You are learning that emotional freedom doesn't mean never being triggered. It means a trigger no longer gets to decide what you do. One of the most exhausting things in a manipulative relationship is the constant need to explain yourself. You explain why you were hurt. You explain what actually happened. You explain your intentions. You provide examples, evidence, memories, and reasons, hoping that eventually the other person will stop arguing and simply understand. But sometimes the problem isn't that you haven't explained yourself clearly enough. The problem is that the other person isn't willing to accept what you're saying. This distinction can change everything. When you constantly defend yourself, you can unknowingly enter a position where the other person becomes the judge of your reality. They question your memory, reinterpret your intentions, deny what happened, or shift the conversation toward your reaction instead of their behavior. Suddenly, you're no longer discussing what happened. You're trying to prove that you're allowed to feel what you feel, and that is where emotional exhaustion begins. You don't need to provide a 20-minute explanation for why something crossed your boundary. You can say, that doesn't work for me. You don't need to convince someone that their disrespect was disrespectful before you step away. You can say, I'm not continuing this conversation while I'm being insulted. You don't need permission to protect your peace. The less you over-explain, the less material there is for someone to twist, debate, or use against you. Your words become clearer because they are no longer buried underneath desperation to be understood. This doesn't mean refusing healthy communication. In a healthy relationship, explanation can create understanding. But when communication repeatedly becomes circular, hostile, or manipulative, continuing to explain yourself may only keep you trapped inside the same conversation. There is also something deeper happening internally. Every time you stop trying to convince someone of your worth, your feelings, or your reality, you begin developing trust in yourself. You learn that your experience doesn't become legitimate only after someone else agrees with it. And eventually you realize that peace doesn't always come from finally finding the perfect words. Sometimes it comes from recognizing that you have already said enough and you no longer need to turn your boundaries into a debate. Building a life that another person cannot emotionally control is one of the deepest ways to reclaim your freedom. When you've been caught in a relationship where someone's attention, approval, anger, or withdrawal determines your emotional state, your world can gradually become smaller. You may start organizing your day around their moods. You may constantly check your phone, wonder what they are thinking, or change your behavior simply to avoid provoking a negative reaction. Without realizing it, their emotional world becomes the center of yours. Reclaiming yourself begins by moving that center back inside you. Start reconnecting with the parts of yourself that existed before the relationship became so consuming. Spend time with people who make you feel grounded. Return to hobbies you abandoned. Learn something new. Focus on your work, goals, creativity, routines, and personal growth. Even simple decisions matter because they remind you that your preferences and desires are still important, but there is a crucial distinction here. Don't rebuild your life to make the other person jealous. Don't post your happiness hoping they'll notice. Don't become successful simply so they will regret losing you. If your entire transformation is still designed around their reaction, they remain psychologically present in your life. Build because you want to live. There may be moments when your mind tries to pull you backward. You might wonder whether they noticed your absence or whether they are thinking about you. Instead of following that thought, bring your attention back to yourself. Ask, what do I need today? That question may seem simple, but it represents a major shift from constantly asking, what do they want from me? As your own life becomes fuller, their ability to control your emotional state can gradually weaken. Their silence becomes less frightening because you have other sources of connection. Their criticism becomes less powerful because you know yourself. Their approval becomes less important because you have developed your own standards. This isn't about becoming unreachable or emotionally numb. It's about becoming internally anchored. You can care about someone and still have a life beyond them. You can feel disappointed without collapsing. You can love someone without making them the measure of your worth. And eventually, you may notice something surprising. The strongest evidence that you've reclaimed yourself isn't that they miss you, regret losing you, or try to come back. It's that you no longer need to know whether they do. One of the hardest things to accept after being hurt by a manipulative person is that closure may never come from them. You may spend months imagining the conversation where they finally understand what they did. You picture them admitting that they were wrong, apologizing sincerely, explaining their behavior, and finally recognizing how deeply their actions affected you. That fantasy is understandable because the mind naturally searches for meaning when something painful feels unresolved. But waiting for another person to provide that resolution can keep you emotionally connected to the very dynamic you are trying to leave. Sometimes you keep returning to the same questions. Why did they treat me this way? Did they ever care? Will they regret losing me? What would make them finally understand? These questions can become a psychological loop. Instead of healing, you remain focused on their thoughts, their feelings, and their future behavior. Your attention stays directed outward when healing requires gradually bringing it back inward. Closure begins when you accept what is actually within your control. You cannot force someone to acknowledge your pain. You cannot make someone develop empathy on your timetable. You cannot manufacture a sincere apology by finding the perfect words or behaving in the perfect way. And you cannot build your emotional recovery around the possibility that they will someday become the person you needed them to be. This acceptance can hurt because it may require grieving more than the relationship itself. You may have to grieve the apology you deserved, the accountability you hoped for, and the version of the relationship you believed could eventually exist. That grief is not weakness. It is part of recognizing reality. Instead of asking, when will they understand what they did to me? Begin asking, what do I understand now that I didn't understand before? Perhaps you understand your boundaries more clearly. Perhaps you recognize patterns you previously ignored. Perhaps you have learned that your worth cannot depend upon another person's ability to validate you. You don't have to erase your anger or pretend the experience didn't matter. You simply stop making your healing conditional upon their transformation. The final shift happens when their apology becomes something you might appreciate, rather than something you desperately need in order to move forward. If you've ever found yourself constantly explaining, defending, chasing, or trying to make someone understand your pain, stay with me. And if this speaks to your experience, share this with someone who needs the reminder. You don't have to destroy someone to stop being controlled by them. Now let's get into the 4 things. There is another powerful shift that happens when you stop playing the role someone else has assigned to you. In unhealthy relationships, people can gradually become trapped in predictable positions. You may become the one who constantly forgives, the one who fixes everything, the one who listens to endless complaints, the one who apologizes first, or the one who keeps trying to rescue the relationship whenever it begins to fall apart. Over time, this role can become so familiar that you mistake it for love. You may tell yourself about if I can just be more patient, more understanding, more supportive, maybe things will finally change. But this can quietly teach the other person that they don't have to take responsibility because you will always return to repair the damage. Stepping out of that role does not mean becoming heartless. It means recognizing where your responsibility ends. You can care about someone's feelings without managing them. You can understand someone's pain without allowing that pain to become an excuse for mistreating you. You can apologize when you genuinely make a mistake without accepting blame for things you didn't do. This is especially difficult when you've spent a long time being conditioned to keep the peace. Saying no may initially feel selfish. Refusing to rescue someone may make you feel guilty. Not responding immediately may make you anxious. Those feelings don't necessarily mean you're doing something wrong. Sometimes they simply mean you're practicing a behavior that is unfamiliar. The important question becomes, am I doing this because I genuinely want to, or because I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't? That question can reveal a great deal. If you always rush to comfort them after they hurt you, stop and notice what happens when you don't. If you constantly solve problems they created, allow them to experience the consequences of their own choices. If you repeatedly accept disrespect because you're afraid of losing the relationship, consider what you are actually losing by remaining in that pattern. You are not responsible for keeping another adult emotionally comfortable at the expense of yourself. Your compassion does not require self-abandonment. The moment you stop performing the role they expect, the relationship dynamic has to change. And whether that change brings reconciliation, distance, or separation, you begin discovering something essential. You are allowed to participate in relationships without disappearing inside them. Another powerful step is learning to accept what you cannot change. This sounds simple, but emotionally it can be one of the most difficult lessons when you've been hurt by someone who refuses to take responsibility. You may spend enormous amounts of energy trying to find the right words, the right explanation, or the right approach that will finally make them understand. You may believe that if they could just see the situation from your perspective, everything would become different. But another person's awareness cannot be forced into existence. You cannot control whether someone develops empathy. You cannot control whether they acknowledge what they did. You cannot control whether they apologize, change their behavior, or suddenly become capable of giving you the relationship you hope for. What you can control is how much access their behavior has to your emotional life. Acceptance doesn't mean approval. It doesn't mean saying what happened was fine. It means looking at reality without continuously fighting against the fact that it is reality. If someone repeatedly shows you that they are unwilling to respect a boundary, accepting that fact may be healthier than spending months trying to convince them to respect it. This is where many people become emotionally exhausted. They aren't only dealing with what happened, they're fighting against what happened. Their mind keeps rewriting the past. Maybe I should have said this. Maybe I reacted incorrectly. Maybe if I had been more patient, they would have changed. These thoughts can create the illusion that you still have control over an outcome that was never entirely yours to control. Instead, ask yourself what is actually within your reach today. You can choose whether to respond. You can choose what behavior you tolerate. You can decide where your attention goes. You can seek support. You can step away from conversations that repeatedly become harmful. You can create distance when necessary. There is grief in accepting limits, because acceptance sometimes means releasing a fantasy of who someone might become. But that grief can also create relief. You no longer have to spend your life convincing someone to give you what they consistently refuse to offer. The goal isn't to become indifferent to people. It is to become deeply honest with yourself about what you can change, what you cannot, and where your energy deserves to go instead. One of the most important things you can do after experiencing a manipulative relationship is learn to separate compassion from access. You can understand that another person may have emotional wounds, insecurity, fear, or unresolved pain without allowing those things to become reasons why you must tolerate harmful behavior. Understanding where someone's behavior comes from can create empathy, but empathy does not require you to remain available for mistreatment. This distinction matters because people often confuse compassion with responsibility. You may think, if I understand why they act this way, maybe I should be more patient. You may start making excuses for repeated disrespect because you can see the pain underneath it, but knowing the possible origin of someone's behavior doesn't erase its impact. A wounded person can still wound another person, and you are allowed to protect yourself from that wound. Healthy compassion begins with yourself as well. If you constantly extend understanding to someone else while dismissing your own exhaustion, fear, or hurt, your compassion has become one-sided. You are giving another person permission to have feelings, while telling yourself that yours must remain quiet. Try asking yourself, would I accept this behavior if I weren't afraid of losing this person? That question can expose how much fear has influenced your choices. Sometimes we tolerate things not because they are acceptable, but because we believe leaving, saying no, or creating distance will cause conflict. You can care without rescuing. You can forgive without restoring the same level of access. You can wish someone healing without volunteering to be the person who heals them. You can acknowledge their struggles without becoming responsible for managing their emotions. This is also where boundaries become an expression of compassion rather than punishment. Saying, "I won't continue this conversation while you're insulting me," isn't cruelty. Saying, "I need space," isn't abandonment. Refusing to participate in manipulation isn't revenge. And if you find yourself feeling guilty for protecting yourself, remember that guilt doesn't always mean you've done something wrong. Sometimes guilt appears because you've stopped doing something you were conditioned to do. Your healing becomes deeper when you no longer need to hate someone in order to create distance from them. You can see their humanity while still honoring your own. You can understand their pain without carrying it. You can hope they change without waiting for them to change before you begin living your own life. The deepest form of freedom is choosing healing over revenge. When someone has hurt you repeatedly, the desire to make them feel the same pain can feel completely natural. You may imagine them experiencing the loneliness, rejection, confusion, or heartbreak they caused you, but there is a hidden danger in making revenge the goal. The person who hurt you can remain psychologically connected to you long after they are physically gone. If your happiness depends on seeing them suffer, then their suffering still has power over your emotional state. You are still checking their life, imagining their reaction, wondering whether they regret losing you, or hoping they finally understand what they did. Your attention remains attached to them, even when you believe you have moved on. Healing asks a different question. Instead of asking, "How can I make them hurt?" you begin asking, "How can I stop carrying this hurt?" That shift can take time. You may still feel anger. You may still remember moments that make you furious. You don't have to suppress those emotions or pretend everything is forgiven. Anger can tell you that something mattered, that a boundary was crossed, or that part of you is demanding protection. The goal isn't to eliminate the emotion. It is to prevent the emotion from becoming the architect of your future. This means investing your energy somewhere more meaningful. Strengthen your relationships with people who treat you with respect. Create routines that make you feel grounded. Work toward goals that have nothing to do with the person who hurt you. Learn to enjoy moments that don't require anyone else's approval. Most importantly, stop measuring your recovery by their reaction. If they miss you, that doesn't prove you've healed. If they regret losing you, that doesn't prove you've healed. If they come back, apologize, or suddenly become interested again, that doesn't determine your worth. Healing becomes real when their behavior stops being the scoreboard. You no longer need to win the breakup, prove your value, or demonstrate that they made the biggest mistake of their life. You simply become more connected to yourself than you are to the conflict. And perhaps that is the greatest freedom available, not making them suffer, but reaching a place where you no longer need anything from them to feel whole. Maybe the title was never really about how to torture a narcissist. Maybe it was about something much deeper, how to stop letting another person's behavior torture you. Because the moment you stop reacting automatically, stop explaining yourself endlessly, stop building your life around their approval, stop waiting for their apology, stop playing the role they assigned you, and stop trying to change what you cannot control, something begins to happen inside you. You become free, not because they finally understood you, not because they finally apologized, not because they suffered, but because you stopped making your healing dependent on what they do next. And that is the part people often misunderstand about healing. Healing doesn't mean you never feel angry again. It doesn't mean you forget what happened. It doesn't mean you excuse harmful behavior or suddenly feel compassion for someone who repeatedly hurt you. It means their behavior no longer gets to determine who you become. You can remember without returning. You can forgive without reopening the door. You can understand someone's wounds without becoming responsible for them, and you can walk away without needing to destroy the person you're leaving. So if someone has convinced you that your worth depends on their attention, remember this. Your worth existed before they noticed you, and it remains after they leave. You don't need revenge. You need your life back. You need your peace back. You need your voice back. And perhaps the most powerful thing you can ever do to a person who depended on controlling your emotions is to become so deeply connected to yourself that their approval, rejection, silence, anger, or affection can no longer determine your direction. That isn't cruelty. That isn't punishment. That is what freedom looks like. And when you finally reach that place, you won't be asking, "How do I make them hurt?" You'll be asking something far more important. How do I make sure I never abandon myself again?